much of an alternative for you. Well, home ownership has just come to a screeching halt. Live with it. Start planning to deal with it. That's the reality of it. You can't afford to bring it current and the bank's not willing to work with you. You've got bankruptcy, maybe, or moving out. It's important to know this so that you can plan. Okay, next slide. Okay, how are we going to evaluate those alternatives? Okay, you're not going to hear me say credit. You will not hear me use credit as a means of evaluating alternatives. It's just not going to happen. You're going to use, what you should be using is deficiency liability. Does the alternative that I'm looking at expose me to deficiency liability? Does the alternative that I'm looking at expose me to tax liability? And the third measuring stick that you're going to use to evaluate alternatives is capacity to pay. Capacity to pay. Now, as to tax liability, that's a loaded subject, and all I'm going to do here today is strongly encourage you to sit down and visit with your tax professional. As you might imagine, the tax liability associated with the loss of the property will also vary from household to household. One's basis in their property varies from household to household, thereby affecting whether or not there's a capital gain. The banks do routinely issue 1099s, which has to do with forgiveness of debt. If you get hit with a 1099, then you've got to contend with that in your tax return for that year. And some of these 1099s that I'm looking at, they're high 6 figures, sometimes 7 figures. Do you want to include that in your income? I don't think so. I definitely wouldn't. So you're going to sit down and you've got to do some tax planning. Sit down with your tax professional and talk about forgiveness of debt and capital gains tax. Capacity to pay. You have to look at that before talking to the lender. Next slide, if you could, please. This is a formula that I like to use to figure out your finances before you talk to your lender. You start with your household income, and you subtract out what I call operating expenses. Ultimately, what you want to figure out is how much income do you have available to pay on principal and interest every month. How much do you have available to pay on principal and interest? When you talk to the lender up on the phone about a loan modification, I'm telling you right now, somebody on the other side of that phone is pulling out an HP 17B calculator when they're doing one of these things. And they're punching out a number. And that number represents principal and interest. There has to be positive amortization on all loans. There has to be positive amortization. So they're going to be looking for that. And they're going to be using their calculator and they're going to be calculating to figure out what that is. Now, if the bank comes back to you and says, we could do $2,500 a month, don't take the deal simply because it's the best deal that the bank's giving you. If your income that you have available for principal and interest is $1,200 a month, why in God's name would you accept an arrangement at $2,500 a month, knowing full well you're going to be in breach of contract? You can't perform on the deal. If you can't perform on the deal, should you be making financial disclosure to the bank? If you're in a $600,000 loan, and that bank hasn't demonstrated a propensity to reduce the principal balance, and all you can afford to pay is $1,200 a month, don't make financial disclosure to the lender. The math just isn't there at $1,200 a month to provide full amortization on a $600,000 obligation. The math isn't there. You've got to do a little bit of homework with that lender. Are they reducing the principal balance? What are they doing? Are they even modifying loans to begin with? One of the handouts I gave you is an article from the Wall Street Journal. It's from August of 2009. But it shows, as of that time, which lenders, what particular lenders were modifying loans. Some weren't modifying them at all. Does that make sense? Plus, you don't want to have in your mind a dollar figure representing principal, interest, insurance, and taxes, property taxes, where the lender has on their mind a figure representing just principal and interest. Then you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to an orange. And that, here again, lends itself to bad decision making. Got to make sure that the dollar figure that the bank is talking about is representing principal and interest, so that you know how much money you have available for principal and interest. Does that make sense? Okay, next slide. Okay. For those of you that are going to negotiate with the lender, be careful. They're tricky. They're tricky. They tend to be tricky. Some of the tricks that we've seen them do, like by way of example, in short sale agreements, the bank will sneak language in there saying you're still going to be obligated to pay the remaining balance of the loan. Well, what's the bank saying there? They're saying, hey buddy, we're reserving our right to come after you for the money. And they're putting that in the contract. They're telling you that. Watch for that. Second thing that banks are doing is they're sticking into these both modification agreements and short sale agreements something called an exculpatory provision. An exculpatory provision is a provision that says you waive all your rights and claims that you have against us, whether you know about them or not. And they're sliding that in. Why? I can tell you why, and I can tell you what I call it. I call it jockeying for position. They're jockeying for position. They're jockeying for position to hammer you if you don't pay without any consequence to them. They're trying to restrict your ability to come back at them in the future. Okay. Before you negotiate with the lender, do a review of your finances. Do that financial calculation that we spoke about. I've had clients come into my office with loan modification agreements, and after we do the financial calculation, they don't have any money available every month to pay their lender. None. No money. Zero to contribute towards principal and interest. Well, why are we talking about loan modification? Well, I want to hold on to my house. Yeah, but you don't have any money. You got to have money to pay. What payments can you afford? Don't give up any anti-deficiency protection. It's hard to contractually waive 580B protection, but you can give up 580D protection by not letting it go into a non-judicial foreclosure. Okay. Okay, next slide. Just remember, whether or not the lender works with you is discretionary with the lender. You don't have a hammer that you can hit them on the head with to force them to work with you. If they won't do it, they won't do it. Okay, next slide. Before you do a short sale, before you do a loan modification, the banks are going to ask you for a financial disclosure. Should you make financial disclosure? I don't know what the exact statistic is, but I see a lot of clients coming into my office that were in stated income loans, You guys ever hear of those loans? Yeah. The real estate industry calls them liar's loans. Liar's loans. They said, well, since the bank isn't going to check and verify what I'm telling them, that's an open invitation for me to make as much money as I can write down on a piece of paper.